What if I told you that Brazil deliberately sank over 1,000 city buses into the Atlantic Ocean in what became the largest artificial reef operation in South American history? It sounds like environmental madness, right? Well, Brazil actually did this. And the result after 15 years has shocked marine biologists and transformed ocean conservation strategies from Florida to the Great Barrier Reef. But here's what makes this story truly incredible. What happened underwater exceeded every scientific prediction and created something that natural reefs take centuries to develop. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a Brazilian Navy vessel, 15 kilometers off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. The morning sun glints off the Atlantic as massive cranes lift decommissioned city buses from cargo ships. These aren't just any buses. They're vehicles that once carried millions of passengers through São Paulo, Rio, and Salvador. Now they're about to become homes for entirely different passengers. One by one, these 12-ton vehicles disappear beneath the waves with thunderous splashes that echo across the ocean. The operation is so massive that it requires coordination between the Brazilian Navy, environmental agencies, and marine research institutions. Over 40 vessels participate in the systematic placement of vehicles across 300 kilometers of coastline. But this isn't random dumping. Each bus is precisely positioned using GPS coordinates and underwater cameras. Marine engineers have calculated exact spacing to maximize water flow and create optimal conditions for marine life colonization. The buses are cleaned, stripped of all fluids and hazardous materials, and specially prepared with access holes to allow fish movement and prevent trapped gas pockets. The scale is absolutely staggering. In total, Brazil would sink more than 1,000 buses, along with decommissioned trains, small aircraft, and retired naval vessels. The combined weight of artificial reef materials exceeds 50,000 tons, equivalent to building an underwater city larger than most Brazilian towns. International observers called it everything from innovative conservation to legalized ocean pollution. Environmental groups were split between those who saw revolutionary potential and others who feared ecological disaster. Marine scientists from around the world flew to Brazil to witness operations that had never been attempted at such scale. But to understand why Brazil would undertake such a massive and controversial project, we need to dive deeper into the crisis that threatened their entire Atlantic marine ecosystem. For decades, Brazil's Atlantic coast faced an environmental catastrophe that most of the world never noticed. The country's 7,500 kilometers of coastline, once teeming with marine life, was experiencing systematic ecological collapse. Fish populations had crashed by 80% since the 1970s. Coral reefs were bleaching and dying at alarming rates. Traditional fishing communities that had sustained themselves for generations were abandoning their boats and moving to cities. The numbers told a devastating story. Brazil's commercial fish catch had declined from 800,000 tons annually in the 1980s to just 200,000 tons by the 2000s. Species that had been abundant, including several varieties of grouper, snapper, and sea bass, were now listed as endangered or commercially extinct in Brazilian waters. The causes were complex and interconnected. Overfishing by industrial trawlers had stripped the ocean of adult breeding populations. Coastal development had destroyed critical nursery habitats where young fish developed. Pollution from major cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo had created dead zones where nothing could survive. Perhaps most critically, Brazil's natural reef systems were collapsing. Unlike the Caribbean or Indo-Pacific, Brazil's Atlantic coast has relatively few natural coral formations. The rocky reefs that did exist were being destroyed by anchor damage, pollution, and warming ocean temperatures. Without these three-dimensional structures, fish had nowhere to shelter, breed, or feed. Marine biologists estimated that Brazil had lost over 60% of its reef habitat in just 3 decades. The remaining natural reefs were overcrowded and stressed, unable to support the marine populations they once sustained. Traditional conservation approaches, marine protected areas, fishing restrictions, pollution controls, were failing to reverse decades of damage. Brazilian fishermen, many from families that had fished for generations, watched their livelihoods disappear. Coastal communities that had once thrived on fishing tourism saw their economies collapse as there were simply no fish left to catch. The few remaining fish were small, young specimens that hadn't had time to reproduce before being caught. The Brazilian government tried conventional solutions. They established marine reserves, implemented fishing quotas, and invested billions in pollution cleanup. But these measures, while important, couldn't address the fundamental problem. There simply wasn't enough habitat left to support healthy fish populations. That's when a group of marine engineers and conservation biologists proposed something that seemed both brilliant and insane. If natural reefs were disappearing, why not build artificial ones on an unprecedented scale? The idea wasn't entirely new. Small artificial reefs using rocks, concrete blocks, and occasionally sunken ships had been tried in various locations worldwide, but no one had ever attempted to create artificial reef systems spanning hundreds of kilometers using systematic deployment of large vehicles. The proposal was controversial from the beginning. Environmental groups worried about introducing pollutants into marine environments. Fishing organizations questioned whether artificial structures could truly replace natural ecosystems. Government officials balked at the costs and logistical complexity. But the Brazilian team had compelling arguments. Modern vehicles, properly cleaned and prepared, were essentially inert steel and aluminum structures that would provide exactly the three-dimensional habitat that marine life required. The materials would last for decades, potentially centuries, providing stable platforms for coral growth and fish shelter. Most importantly, they could be deployed quickly and at scale. While natural reef restoration might take decades to show results, artificial reefs could begin attracting marine life within months of deployment. The first experimental deployment took place in 2009 off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. 20 decommissioned buses were carefully prepared, cleaned of all hazardous materials, and positioned on the sandy ocean floor 18 meters below the surface. The buses were arranged in clusters to maximize water circulation, while creating protected spaces for marine life. Marine biologists installed underwater cameras and monitoring equipment to document whatever happened next. The initial results were better than anyone had dared to hope. Within just 2 weeks, small fish species began exploring the new structures. Schools of sergeant majors, chromis, and wrasses were seen swimming through bus windows and taking shelter under the vehicles. Algae and bacteria began colonizing the metal surfaces, providing food for herbivorous fish species. By month 3, larger predator fish, snappers, groupers, and jacks had discovered the artificial reef. The buses were providing exactly what these species needed: shelter during the day and ambush points for hunting at dawn and dusk. Octopi moved into wheel wells and engine compartments, creating dens in spaces that perfectly mimicked natural rock crevices. The transformation accelerated dramatically in the second year. Soft corals and sponges began growing on the bus exteriors, creating colorful living coatings that attracted even more marine species. Sea turtles were observed using the buses as cleaning stations, allowing cleaner fish to remove parasites and algae from their shells. Most remarkably, fish populations around the artificial reef were not just surviving, they were thriving. Species counts showed 200% higher diversity compared to nearby areas without artificial structures. More importantly, the fish were larger and showed clear signs of successful reproduction. Encouraged by these results, Brazil expanded the program dramatically. In 2011, they deployed 200 additional buses along a 50-kilometer stretch of coastline. The operation involved unprecedented coordination between naval vessels, environmental monitors, and research teams. Each deployment became more sophisticated. Engineers developed standardized preparation protocols, ensuring that vehicles were completely free of pollutants. Marine biologists optimized spacing and orientation to maximize colonization success. Underwater construction techniques improved with each operation. The buses themselves were modified before sinking. Additional holes were cut in floors and walls to improve water circulation and prevent gas traps. Surfaces were roughened to encourage marine organism attachment. Some vehicles were partially filled with clean rock or concrete to ensure stable positioning on the sea floor. By 2015, Brazil had deployed over 800 vehicles across multiple sites along their Atlantic coast. The program expanded beyond buses to include decommissioned trains, small aircraft, and retired military vehicles. Each site was carefully selected based on water depth, current patterns, and proximity to existing marine populations. But the real breakthrough came when long-term monitoring revealed something extraordinary. The artificial reefs weren't just attracting existing fish populations. They were actually increasing the overall carrying capacity of Brazilian coastal waters. Natural reefs in the region typically supported about 150 fish species. The artificial reef sites consistently documented over 250 species, including several that had been locally extinct for decades. More importantly, fish populations at artificial sites showed reproductive success rates 300% higher than surrounding areas. The artificial reefs were functioning as nurseries, providing perfect conditions for juvenile fish to mature before moving to other habitats. They served as cleaning stations where large marine animals came to be serviced by smaller, cleaner species. Most remarkably, they became feeding aggregation sites where nutrients were concentrated and distributed throughout the broader marine ecosystem. Brazilian marine biologist Dr. Carlos Nunes, who monitored the sites for over a decade, described the transformation as beyond our most optimistic projections. Fish populations that had been commercially extinct began reappearing in sustainable numbers. Species diversity increased not just at the artificial reef sites, but throughout the broader region, as improved breeding success spread marine populations across the coastline. The economic impact on fishing communities was dramatic. Coastal towns that had lost their fishing industries began experiencing tourism booms as diving and fishing charters brought visitors to explore the artificial reefs. Local fishermen found sustainable catches within easy reach of their ports for the first time in decades. Restaurant owners in coastal communities reported being able to source fresh local fish again after years of relying on imports or frozen products. The artificial reefs weren't just restoring marine ecosystems, they were revitalizing human communities that depended on ocean resources. But perhaps most importantly, the success of Brazil's artificial reef program caught the attention of marine conservation organizations worldwide. What had started as a desperate attempt to address local ecosystem collapse became a model for ocean restoration on a global scale. Marine scientists from dozens of countries visited Brazilian reef sites to study the techniques and results. The methods developed in Brazilian waters were adapted for different marine environments and species compositions around the world. The Florida Keys, facing similar coral reef decline, began deploying decommissioned vessels using techniques refined in Brazil. Australia started experimental artificial reef programs to support Great Barrier Reef restoration efforts. Mediterranean countries initiated vehicle reef projects to address overfishing and habitat loss. By 2020, over 20 countries had established artificial reef programs inspired by Brazilian innovations. The global inventory of deliberately sunk vehicles for marine conservation exceeded 5,000 units, representing one of the largest coordinated marine habitat restoration efforts in human history. But the most surprising development came in 2023, when long-term monitoring revealed effects that no one had anticipated. The artificial reefs weren't just supporting fish populations, they were transforming entire marine ecosystems in ways that natural reefs take centuries to achieve. Sea turtle populations showed the most dramatic recovery. Green sea turtles, which had virtually disappeared from Brazilian coastal waters, began returning in unprecedented numbers. The artificial reefs provided perfect foraging grounds with abundant algae and seagrass growing on vehicle surfaces. More importantly, the complex three-dimensional structures offered protection from predators during vulnerable feeding periods. Female sea turtles began using artificial reef sites as navigation landmarks during migration to nesting beaches. Researchers documented navigation behavior that suggested turtles were actively seeking out artificial reef locations, using them as rest stops during long-distance migrations between feeding and breeding areas. The artificial reefs became breeding aggregation sites for species that had shown declining reproduction rates throughout the region. Schools of commercially important fish species, snappers, groupers, and jacks were observed in mating displays around the vehicle structures. The reefs provided the territorial boundaries and shelter that these species required for successful reproduction. Most remarkably, the artificial sites began developing characteristics typically associated with much older natural reef systems. Slow-growing hard corals, which normally take decades to establish, were colonizing vehicle surfaces and beginning to create living reef structures. Some buses deployed in 2009 were becoming unrecognizable under thick layers of coral growth. The biodiversity explosion extended to species never before documented in Brazilian waters. Researchers identified tropical fish species that had apparently extended their ranges southward, using the artificial reefs as stepping stones to colonize previously unsuitable habitats. The reefs were functioning as biodiversity corridors, connecting previously isolated marine populations. Underwater photographers and documentary filmmakers began describing the artificial reef sites as more spectacular than natural reefs. The combination of familiar human structures colonized by exotic marine life created surreal underwater landscapes that attracted international attention. The economic benefits expanded far beyond fishing and tourism. Brazil developed expertise in artificial reef construction and marine habitat restoration that became valuable exports. Brazilian marine engineering companies began winning contracts for artificial reef projects in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Universities established specialized programs in artificial reef design and marine restoration. International students traveled to Brazil to study techniques that were becoming global standards for ocean habitat restoration. The knowledge and technology developed through the Bus Reef program created new industries and career paths. Marine research institutions worldwide began collaborating with Brazilian scientists to develop next-generation artificial reef technologies. Experimental materials, optimized designs, and enhanced monitoring techniques emerged from the international research network that grew around Brazil's pioneering program. The success also generated political momentum for expanded marine conservation efforts. The Brazilian government increased funding for coastal restoration, established new marine protected areas, and implemented policies supporting sustainable fishing practices. The Artificial Reef program became a model for how innovative thinking could address environmental challenges while creating economic opportunities. International environmental organizations, many of which had initially criticized the program as experimental and risky, began promoting artificial reefs as proven conservation tools. The techniques developed in Brazil were incorporated into global marine conservation strategies and climate change adaptation plans. Perhaps most importantly, the program demonstrated that marine ecosystem restoration could be achieved on timescales relevant to human communities. While natural reef restoration might require generations, artificial reef deployment could deliver measurable ecosystem benefits within years. The model inspired similar thinking about other environmental challenges. If discarded vehicles could restore marine ecosystems, what other waste materials could be transformed into environmental solutions? The program sparked innovation in environmental engineering and circular economy approaches to conservation. Today, visitors to Brazil's artificial reef sites encounter underwater worlds that seem almost impossible. Schools of tropical fish swim through the windows of city buses that once navigated São Paulo traffic. Sea turtles rest on the hoods of vehicles that formerly carried commuters to work. Octopi make their homes in wheel wells, while rays glide over rooftops covered in living coral. The transformation from urban transportation to marine habitat represents one of the most successful examples of turning human waste into environmental benefit. What began as an experimental solution to a local crisis became a global model for creative conservation. Marine biologists estimate that Brazil's artificial reef program has created habitat equivalent to over 500 hectares of natural reef ecosystem value that would have taken nature centuries to develop. The sites continue expanding as marine growth covers more vehicle surfaces and attracts additional species. The program's success has inspired second-generation innovations. Newer deployments incorporate lessons learned from 15 years of monitoring. Vehicle preparation techniques have improved, spacing optimization has advanced, and monitoring technologies provide real-time ecosystem health data. Brazil is now planning the next phase of expansion, with goals of deploying an additional 2,000 vehicles by 2030. The program has transformed from an emergency response to ecosystem collapse into a permanent component of Brazil's marine conservation strategy. The success story continues to inspire conservation efforts worldwide. Countries facing similar marine degradation are adapting Brazilian techniques to their own environments and challenges. The artificial reef revolution that began with Brazilian buses has become a global movement toward creative ocean restoration. From city streets to ocean floors, from transportation to conservation, from local experiment to global model. Brazil's bus reef program proves that the most innovative environmental solutions often come from thinking beyond conventional approaches. The buses that once carried people through Brazilian cities now carry marine life toward a more sustainable future. What other discarded resources do you think could be transformed into environmental solutions?